All right, we're going to try this again. It appears to me that the sound is working. So I'm going to just go with that and trust that it's working well enough, I guess. And we'll go from there. So I'm just going to go ahead and wait for a couple folks to arrive and welcome you guys. And we'll then go ahead and continue our look at the book of Galatians, which I've talked about in the past. And we're going to continue to look at it because I think that it's such an important one. Now, I don't wish to be just seen as a person who's just bashing Adventists or Adventism, though I could live with being a basher of Adventism, but I don't want to be viewed as somebody who's just bashing the Seventh-day Adventist people. Certainly not. My issue is with the theology and not with the people. I fear a lot of people follow it simply because they don't know any better. Not to say that there aren't some that don't actually know exactly what it's saying and still follow it nonetheless. That's why for me, the book of Galatians is so important. And I know for a number of people who have left Adventism, it was a crucial book in helping them make their departure. So that's what I'd like to spend some time on today, is just continuing our look at the book of Galatians. So we find ourselves today here still in Galatians chapter 2. And the first part of it, just as a quick refresher, is Paul writes this letter as he spent time with the Galatian people, with those churches. He gave them the gospel, the true gospel. They were living that gospel. And then we're told that some Judaizers came into the church and began to drop their seeds of doubt, meaning basically, thank you, Teresa, meaning basically doubt in the true gospel, what they were, that they were saved by grace through faith, and that they were new creatures. Specifically, what these Judaizers were doing was saying, yeah, the faith is important. The faith's important, but it just needs a little, namely works, or in this case, it needed very often circumcision and the dietary laws. And so Paul begins by putting out a huge, strong, basically a curse on anyone who preaches any gospel other than the gospel he had been preaching, whether it be people or even angels. If anyone preaches any other gospel, let them be accursed. That's there in Galatians chapter 1. And then he begins by expressing his discipleship, his apostleship, if you will, by explaining his credentials, who he was, what he was prior to receiving the gospel, and also his interaction with Christ himself and that calling that he received from Christ himself. He goes from there, and then he starts talking about, and so when that was all, Paul is saying, basically when that was all happening, then after 14 years, if memory serves, after 14 years, I finally went up to Jerusalem to kind of get their authority, not because I was going to change anything, but just I can do more with their approval than if I know they're working against me and I get their disapproval. And so he went there and he talked to them about that. And it's at that time that now in the book of Galatians, he's referring back to that time where he said that there were people even then that were coming in and trying to say, hey, there are certain things you have to do. It's not just believing. There's some other things you have to do. And you can read about that all in the book of Acts. I believe what we're talking about here is the council, Jerusalem council, where they finally said, listen, here's what we've concluded. They need to do this and this. And basically it was believe, it was to continue to give money, it was to abstain from food that I think that still had its blood in it. And again, the reason for that restriction was simply because the church at that time was mixed. There were Jews who had lived their entire lives as Jews that were now believers, and there were Gentiles who were believers. And many of the Jewish believers were still adherents to these dietary laws. Okay, so that's the only reason that he was saying to do that, not because it is actually expected of every believer, because you can read in Paul's writings and he says things like sorry, I'm going off script. The bottom line is Paul makes it clear in his other writings that it's not crucial that we continue to abide by those dietary restrictions. But he is showing that at that time, when these Judaizers came in, that he and Paul and Peter and the others opposed it strongly. Okay? And now he's changing, now he's moving. Okay, now he's moving his time frame. And so this is where we find ourselves here in Galatians chapter 2, starting in verse 11. He says, "But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like the Jews?" And now in this section, now he changes. He ends up, he's telling you this scenario, which we're going to talk about in a little more detail here shortly. He talks about this one scenario of Peter himself falling prey to this deceptive theology, this deceptive ideal that is often pushed. Peter himself fell prey to it. But then he now moves on. After telling that story, he now is starting to get into the crux of this letter. And he says, "We ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. Yet we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. So we also have believed in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law, because by works of the law, no one will be justified. But if, in our endeavor to be justified in Christ, we too are found to be sinners, is Christ then the servant of sin? Certainly not. For if I rebuild what I tore down, I prove myself to be a transgressor. For through the law I died to the law, so that I might live to God. I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not nullify the grace of God. For if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. If righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose." 10 little verses, 10 little verses that I would be here all afternoon if I tried to dig in and unpack all 10 of those verses. It is an enormous amount. But as I think about that, as I read that story, I think about a few things. First off, when we see here that let's see, but when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face. So that might be a verse that you just kind of pass over. So he's just stating out loud that he opposed him to his face. I think, and there are commentators who are in agreement with this perspective, that Paul is contrasting. What do you mean he's contrasting? Well, I can tell you something right now. I'm not proud of this. I'm using this only because I want you to understand that I understand what I think Paul is really saying here. So when I was an Adventist, there was this guy that I went to church with that I liked well enough. His name is Adam, still a friend of mine. And Adam seemed to always be that guy that in our Sabbath school classes, not Sunday school, in our Sabbath school classes, he would always he would oppose. He would always push back. He would always challenge. And I was a by the book Billy. I was a toe the line Tim. I whatever the pastor said, that's what I did. Whatever the church doctrine said, that's what I did. Whatever Ellen White said, that's what I believed. And so I really didn't like the way Adam always questioned and gave pushback. And so you know what I did? Did I oppose him to his face? Mm-mm. I would just talk to other people and warn them about Adam. I would warn them about, well, you need to watch out for his theology. I mean, I love Adam. Adam's a good guy, but you got to watch his theology. I'm not sure where he's coming from, blah, 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 blah. But never, when Adam would say these things in public, did I ever like really oppose him to his face or publicly. And I think that is what Paul is saying here. He's like, listen, since I came there and I gave you the gospel and then I left, those Judaizers have yet to come to me. They've yet to come to me directly and say, here's our problem with your theology. No, what they do is they go behind my back and they go and start whispering in your ear. And you believe it, and now they've got you off track. Paul is saying the way I handle it is when Peter does something like this, Paul says, I did not automatically go out to the other people there and say, hey guys, you know what? I think Peter's got it all wrong here. He's really doing disservice to the gospel. No. If he was so opposed by what Peter was saying, what he did is he directly went to him in front of everyone. And you can see right here how important that is. He says, the reason it's important is because right there, he says, for the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. That is why it had to be dealt with publicly, because if this behavior that Peter was exhibiting continues, it actually injures, distorts the true gospel. Because what was going on here was, for a long time, back in Jerusalem, Peter is rock solid. He's rock solid on what are new believers obligated to do. Back in Jerusalem, they were already saying it needs to be circumcision in the dietary law. And he said no. They said no, it doesn't have to be that. The only dietary restriction was don't eat food that still had its lifeblood in it. That's it. Okay, but there was no other dietary law, and Peter was solid on it. And yet we find here, I don't know the time frame. I don't know how much time has passed, but here we find him, and it says, "For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles, and when they came, he drew back." What Paul saw was, hold on a second here. For the last month or two, you've been eating bacon, you've been eating pork, now some, the Adventists go, we have no indication whatsoever that he was eating pork. Okay. Okay, let's go ahead. I can't argue that. But he clearly was eating with the Gentiles. True? Sure, because it says right here that he was eating with the Gentiles. Now, maybe it just so happens that the food he was eating with the Gentiles, maybe he was still eating clean food. But if it was eating with the Gentiles, it's unlikely that the Gentiles were preparing the food in the same way that the Jews would, which would automatically have deemed it all unclean. So whether or not he was eating pork or not, he could have been eating a chicken breast. Fine. But if it wasn't cooked in the proper ritualistic Jewish fashion, it would have been deemed unclean. So he might as well have been eating pork. Are you following me? So he was already living not like a Jew. But the moment these Judaizers show up, all of a sudden he wants to pull back and live like a Jew. This is what Paul's issue is here, because he understood that if this is allowed, if someone at the stature of Peter is able to be dissuaded and to be fooled by something, if he is able to stay unchecked and continue to live in this fashion, many are going to be deceived. Many are going to be lost. The gospel is going to be distorted. That's why this was such a crucial issue. Now, I've told you in the past that for me, the book of Galatians was incredibly powerful. But I need to tell you another component of it for me that was so important was when I went out and I found Martin Luther's commentary on the book of Galatians. And I'm telling you right now, that was so insightful. And so what I've done is I'm going to give you some quotes. Now you can very, very easily go out to Google, search for Martin Luther's commentary on Galatians. It's free. You can read it. It's great. So here are a couple things that I want to highlight that Martin Luther noted about this passage here, specifically about verse 12. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. So this is what this is some of the, I've taken, I'm not taking these out of context. I'm not quoting everything, but he said, Paul does not accuse Peter of malice or ignorance, but a lack of principle, in that he abstained from meats because he feared the Jews that came from James. Now listen, Peter's weak attitude endangered the principle of Christian liberty. It is the deduction rather than the fact which Paul reproves. To eat and to drink or not to eat and drink is immaterial. But to make the deduction, if you eat, you sin. If you abstain, you are righteous. This is wrong. This is Martin Luther's point here. And this is Paul's point. Okay, it's not a matter of whether you should eating or drinking. That is immaterial. Salvation is no longer a question of what you eat or what you drink. The problem is when you make the deduction, if you eat, you sin. If you abstain, you're righteous. That is still, if not an explicit theology, it is an understood theological belief in Adventism to this day. Anybody here disagree with that? Anyone here can acknowledge that? Please let me know. That is still something that is believed today. I know personally, myself, my family, and I have still Adventist friends who their lives tell you that they believe this. If you eat, you sin. If you abstain, you're righteous. And then Martin Luther goes on and he says, meats may be refused for two reasons. First, they may be refused for the sake of Christian love. There's no danger connected with a refusal of meats for the sake of charity. To bear with the infirmity of our brother is a good thing. Paul himself taught and exemplified such thoughtfulness. Okay, that's the first one. Thank you. Awesome. Okay. EL, by the way, I got your message earlier about more of the Joseph story. I didn't know anybody was listening. I recorded those and never knew anybody was even listening. So since you said that, I will put some time and effort into continuing that series as well. Okay. All right. So first off, he says there are two reasons why you would refuse meat. One is for charity. In other words, and this is what Paul talks about, if the weaker brother, if you know someone is weak in their faith and they don't eat meat, then don't eat meat around them. That's reason number one. Number two, he said, secondly, meats may be refused in the mistaken hope. Here we go. They may be refused in the mistaken hope of thereby obtaining righteousness. When this is the purpose of abstaining from meats, we say, let charity go. To refrain from meats for this latter reason amounts to a denial of Christ. What? What? To refrain from meats for this latter purpose is the mistaken way that I can somehow gain righteousness. That amounts to a denial of Christ. If we must lose one or the other, let us lose a friend or a brother rather than God our Father. In other words, you can never let your thoughts be, I'm going to abstain from this because it makes me more righteous. Okay. He goes on, Peter offended by giving the impression that he was endorsing the law. By pulling back, many could look at it and go, oh, he believes that we are still supposed to be separated from the Gentiles, which is what the law told us. That's what it could be perceived as. By his example, he encouraged Gentiles and Jews to forsake the truth of the gospel. If Paul had not reproved him, there would have been a sliding back of Christians into the Jewish religion and a return to the burdens of the law. And now he adds this. So I love that statement right there. He's telling you exactly what was at stake here and exactly why Paul had to and why he did what he did. And then Martin Luther goes and adds this other thing. He says, it is surprising that Peter, excellent apostle that he was, should have been guilty of such vacillation, that he could shift between Jerusalem and here. In a former council of Jerusalem, he practically stood alone in defense of the truth that salvation is by faith without the law. Peter at that time valiantly defended the liberty of the gospel, but now, by abstaining from meats forbidden in the law, he went against his better judgment. You have no idea what danger there is in customs and ceremonies. They so easily tend to error in works. Now, I'm going to read that sentence one more time, because I believe that Martin Luther is so onto something right here. So here's what he said again. You have no idea what danger there is in customs and ceremonies. They so easily tend to error in works. Now, I'm going to tell you something. When Martin Luther read that, he had something very specific in view. When I read that, let me rephrase that. When he wrote that, he had something very specific in view. When I read that, I have something very specific in view. What's the difference? When he wrote that, Martin Luther was looking at the Catholic Church and all of its ceremonies and all of its pomp and circumstance. If you don't know, he despised it. He would look at them and their robes and everything, and then he would look at the biblical description of Christ and go, these look nothing alike. When I read that today, and I see the danger there is in customs and ceremonies, what do I see? I see the Sabbath. I see the dietary laws. And it says that he's right when he says they so easily tend to error in works. Martin Luther nailed this. He could not be more right than he is. That was what is really at stake here. Even though, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like the Jews. Which is why I oppose many of my Adventist friends when they're on Facebook or whatever, and they're making their posts and saying some of the most heretical things ever. That's why I will oppose them. I'm not trying to come at them like a jerk. I'm not trying to make it a personal thing, but I will oppose it. I'm going to let my opinion be seen. Anybody who's going to read that post, they're going to see my position. I am still of the opinion that you can get more flies with, was it honey rather than vinegar? So I do believe that I need to present my arguments and my opposition in a still a godly way. But anyhow, so now we're going to kind of move into this next section here. So this is verse 15. We ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. And he begins to start talking about justification. Now, what I want to talk about in this next section is, when I was departing Adventism, when I was out of Adventism, and I've said this to many before, I was very confused on what the gospel was. I really was confused on what the gospel was, because for so long, the gospel and law had all intertwined together. And so for me, when I concluded finally that I'm not obligated to live by the law, if the whole thing is intertwined with the gospel and the law is gone, like, so what am I left with? What is the gospel? What is the plan of salvation? How is a person saved? And it's through books like Galatians, it's through books like Romans, and many of Paul's writings that I was able to finally get to the point where I could understand. And it was then, and it was also only then, that I was able to kind of look back at Adventism and see, in what my opinion are some of the glaring problems. The glaring problems. So let me give you an example. An Adventist would never state that a person is saved because they obey the law. They would never state that. They realize that would be taken, rightly so, as complete and utter heresy. But what Adventists and many legalistic religions have no problem stating is that in order to remain saved, you must obey the law to remain saved. So they'll tell you straight to your face, oh, no, you're saved by grace through faith. But what they're talking about is the entry point into salvation. And for a long time ago, I can remember I used to be an avid golfer. I would golf all the time, too much, some might say. And so I was always thinking about country clubs and how gorgeous country clubs were, where your every need is met. But I could never afford to belong to a country club. And so this idea came to me, like, what if I was driving by this country club and there was basically saying, it's an open house, come on in. And in fact, you can come and you can play here for one day for free. You can experience the clubhouse life without being an actual member. And so I come in and it is gorgeous. The facilities are impeccable, state of the art. The golf course is just finely manicured, and I play one of the best rounds of my life. And when it's all over, I'm almost a little bit, I am sad because like it's over. But then they have this person comes out and says, listen, would you like to be a member? Like, yeah, I'd love to be a member. I just can't. Oh, no, Scott, you don't understand. All you have to do to be a member here is to say, I want to be a member. And I'm like, what? Yeah, that's all you have to do. If you want to be a member of this impeccable, incredible golf course, just to be a member here, just say, I want to be a member. And I go, well, I want to be a member. There you are. You're a member. And I'm like, this is amazing. This is amazing. And so I continue to come now daily to the club. And then all of a sudden, that same person comes up to me and they said, "Now, Scott, I understand. So you're a member. Yeah, that's okay, great. It was fantastic. Thank you guys for having me. That's fine. Now, do you want to remain a member?" And then I'm like, hold on, what? Yeah, they said, yeah, to become a member is free. All you had to do is say, I want it. If you want to remain a member, you must boom, 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 boom. This is what Adventists do. This is what Adventism does. This is what, and it's not restricted to Adventism. This is not restricted to Adventism, Catholicism, and other works-based religions, same way. That if you want to stay in here, you have to do these things. And that has never made any sense to me whatsoever. Because as we can read from the Bible about justification, it's obtained through one thing. So that got me to thinking, well, what does justification really mean? The word justification, what does it really mean? Well, the definition that I found is the action of showing something to be right or reasonable. Now, Paul and the other apostles talk about all the time about being justified by faith, justified by faith. So what does that mean? That means then that by faith, if we become justified, that is an action of showing something to be right or reasonable. Another one that I like a lot is an act or an instance of justifying something. And then they give you this other synonym, vindication. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, up until this morning, I had never really kind of put those two words together, justification and vindication. And that made me think, well, hold on. Well, what does vindicate? What's the definition of vindicate? Here's the definition: to free from allegation or blame. To free from allegation or blame. To be justified can also mean to be free from allegation or blame. And now, you guys ready for this one? You ready for this one? In the 16th century, when they were defining the word vindication, they no longer mean it this way, or it's no longer defined in this way. But in the 16th century, the way they would define vindicate is to set free or to deliver. And I like that a lot. I like that a lot. To be set free, to be delivered. And that's exactly what I feel justification is that I am now no longer a slave to sin. I've been set free from that. I like that a lot better. But what does justification gain for me? Why do I decide? Why do I desire justification? Well, I'm going to let you know right now. I actually went out this morning and was looking at some articles, and I found one by John Piper. And he gave four things that are gained by justification. Number one, the forgiveness of all of our sins. And you'd have to, if you want to go ahead and find John's article on that, he gives you the scriptural basis for that. But he goes into Romans, and in Romans, when Paul talks about that, he quotes David. And David talks about being blessed is the man whose sins are forgiven, whose sins are not reckoned to him anymore. So one of the first great blessings of moving into that realm of being justified is that I'm forgiven of all my sins, all the sins I have committed and all the sins I ever will commit. God has known those sins before I breathed my first breath. Before the foundation of the earth, God knew. And he has forgiven me the sins I've committed up to this moment, and he has forgiven me for the sins that I will commit after this moment. The second thing is we are reckoned righteous with an alien righteousness. In other words, the righteousness of Christ. It is imputed righteousness on our behalf. There is nothing you and I can do to make ourselves righteous, whether it's abstaining from food, or abstaining from meats, abstaining from alcohol, dressing a certain way, going to church on a certain day. None of those things make us righteous. Justification means his righteousness, his alien righteousness, is imputed onto me. The third thing is we are now loved by God and treated with grace. Okay? We are loved by God and treated with grace. And here's the fourth thing. And this is a powerful one. This is a powerful one. We are secured by God forever. We are secured by God forever. You may be familiar with the verse in Romans where it says, those who were predestined, he called. Those who he called, he justified. And those who he justified, he glorified. These are not questions of if. These are not questions of if. They are statements of fact. Those who he predestined, he called. Those who he called, he justified. And those who he justified, he glorified. There's no way out of that. This is God's plan. The question often is justification equal to salvation? Because they are so terribly close. And I guess what I'd say to you is this. Based upon that statement, those whom he predestined, he called. Those who he called, he justified. Those who he justified, he glorified. Tells me that salvation it was before I existed. It is while I exist. It is after I exist. I'm going to say that again. Salvation was before I existed. He predestined me. It is while I existed, he called me, he justified, and it is after me when he glorified me. That is all salvation. And I finally move as a sinner into that plan, into that salvation by justification. And how was I justified? Because something I did? No, I'm justified through faith. And let me just blow your minds a little more. Is that some faith that I mustered up? Is that some faith that I worked on? No, that faith is a gift from God. You and I have little to nothing to do with our salvation. Salvation is of the Lord, is what the Bible said. Salvation is of the Lord. It was him who predestined. It is him who called. It's him who justified. It's him who glorifies. So when we start saying it's my works, and now a really important question that you might find with your Adventist or other works-based friends is to ask this question then. Can we lose our justification? See, the justification is a legal decree. It is God saying, I find this just. I find this good. All right? It's a statement. This is the legal finding. There is no appeal process. The devil cannot appeal. I want to appeal this finding that God has. No, it doesn't work that way. Now, the question of can we lose justification? The Lutheran Church, the Lutheran position has been historically yes, but it is only then if one loses their faith. Let me just say something. I can understand that position. I don't agree with that position, but I can understand that position. Well, why do you say that, Scott? Because I'm saying, how did I enter into that justification? Through faith. So it would stand to reason then, the only way I could lose that justification is if I lost that faith. And that's what the Lutheran position has predominantly been. The Catholic view is, can a person lose their justification? Yes. For them, it is if somebody commits a mortal sin. The moment you say the word commits, you're already thinking about works. Doing something or not doing something. Both are works. Abstaining from something is a work, or doing something is a work. Don't be misled there. But for the Catholic Church, their position is, yes, you can lose the justification if you commit a mortal sin. Something that always just stuns me is, as much as the Adventist Church despises Catholicism and its theology, they are hand in hand right here. The Catholic Church and the Seventh-day Adventist Church in its theology. And you're like, Scott, well, where do you say that? I'll tell you right now, when they basically take Ellen White's words and they believe that the Sabbath is the seal of God, they say the Sabbath is the seal of God. You are saying, in order to me to have that seal, I must do something. I must do something. And I'm going to tell you something right now. The mark of the beast and the seal of God. If we read in Revelation that the marks are in two different places, the seal of God is only in the forehead, and the Antichrist, the mark of the beast, is in the forehead or the hand. The Catholic Church says in order to be saved, you must add faith and works. Okay? The mark of the beast. The mark of the beast is both belief and action. It is a combining. It is a distorting of the gospel. So for Adventists, to this day, to say you can lose your salvation because of the things you do, because there's your extreme Adventists who claim they demand perfection and they believe that perfection can be attained. This has to be rejected, because they are teaching that it is not just faith alone, because they love, don't they love to take you to the book of James and they go, faith without works is dead. Faith and works, never for salvation. Never for salvation. They play no role in the role of justification or your salvation. The reformers were adamant on this point. We are saved by grace alone, through faith alone. Their works have no role in there. So I'm going to add this one to you. So Lutheran version, yes, you could lose it based upon if you lost your faith. I could understand it. I don't agree with it, but I understand it at least. Catholics, yes, if you commit a mortal sin, if you don't do something. Catholics will tell you right now with no embarrassment, we are saved by faith plus works. We maintain our salvation by faith plus works. The Reformed tradition generally holds that justification can never be lost. And that got me thinking, why? Why is it that it can never be lost? Well, in addition to what does justification give us? And I said it gives us our forgiveness of our sins. We're reckoned righteousness with an alien righteousness. Our justification lets us know we are loved by God and we're treated with grace. And ultimately, we are secured by God forever. Remember, those whom he predestined, he also called. Those who he called, he justified. Those he justified, he glorified. Here's why. If I had to argue that in a different way, it would be this way. I said to you that I agree with what Martin Luther is saying and the Lutheran position, and that is the only way one could lose their salvation is if they lost their faith. Okay? Because faith is what got you in. So I understand the ideal that faith is the only way you could go out. But what I would say is this, though. Let's talk about that faith. That faith is not our own, is not something that we mustered up. That faith is a gift from God. And God only gives good gifts. Okay? Remember that the salvation, the justification, the sanctification that the Bible talks about is not our works. It is Christ in us. This is what righteousness is Christ in us. When Christ is in us, the faith is there. The faith cannot go away. That is why, for most Reformed, They believe that once I'm justified forever. It's not because I trust myself, because I do not trust myself. This is not saying that I am sinless, I am perfect. I am not. It is Christ who lives in me. And this is what Paul continues to talk about even in this letter to the Galatians and in the book of Romans. So for me, heading back over here, back to Galatians, when he covers this section, verses 15 through 21, he is stressing this point that we cannot be justified by works. Paul knew better than anyone that, I want you to think about this for a second, the law, there was nothing saving about the law. The law's role was to condemn. The law's job was to point out your sin, not to save you, because there is nothing any of us can do. No one can keep it. So when Paul says, if I rebuild what I tore down, I prove myself to be a transgressor. If I build that law back up and try to live by it, guess what I find out? I can't do it. The law's role has never been to save. The law's role has always been to show, to be a mirror, to show you your sin, to bring you to a point of repentance and for you to acknowledge your need, to accept Christ, and then live by grace through faith. The good works will come. The good works, I'm sorry to the Adventists. The Adventists many oftentimes believe the 10 Commandments equals good works. Nope. Not the same thing. And this is where we get to this point where I said that the faith cannot be lost. It goes right back down here to verse 20. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not nullify the grace of God. For if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. If righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. This is something he writes here in Galatians. He also writes this in the book of Romans. There is no righteousness from the law. Is the law sin? No. Is the law bad? No, it's great. You can't live up to it. You're broken and you need a savior. That's where we find ourselves. So it's basically, I've been doing these about a month at a time. So I guess I'll see you guys in a month-ish for chapter 3 of Galatians. Moving right along, chapter 4 is an enormous one. It's fantastic. So I hope you guys are enjoying this. Hope you're being blessed by this. And hope you're also all being safe here during lockdown. Hopefully it will end soon, and hopefully everyone's going to be safe and we're not going to have more problems. But all that to say, thank you guys for spending a few 48 minutes of your day with me. I hope you're all well, and we'll see you very soon. God bless you guys. We'll see you.